Continuing with thoughts about the brain, here's an interview with Erin Sadler, who calls herself a brain coach. I would say she would be an addiction counselor. She does a bit of a dive into the functioning of the brain. Watch this and then afterwards try saying to yourself, yeah, this brain was all formed by natural selection.
I think, first of all, think of our brains as like these multifunctional, complex parts of our body that God creates for us so that we can experience the world around us and fully experience the world around us. And when you think about our brains, so here I'm going to nerd out, Ashley. We have about 6,000 thoughts a day that we think. When we think all of those thoughts in our day, how that kind of happens in our brain is through neurons. So neurons we have 86 billion of them in our brains. We got a lot of them. And they look like trees. I think they look like trees. There's sort of a picture of them, and they have branches called dendrites. Then there's the cell body, more than you ever want to know, axon, and then there's an axon terminal. And why that's important to understand is when we choose our thoughts, and we choose the thoughts that work for us, we can actually grow bigger, stronger branches at the top. Those dendrites can grow stronger, and that actually makes our synaptic connections go faster. So we can actually kind of do weightlifting for our brain, and if 86 billion neurons didn't immediately make you be like, wow, here, I'll give you this fact. So you have 100 trillion synaptic connections in your brain. And just to put that into context, they think that there are 100 trillion stars in our galaxy. So God created our brain to have a galaxy's worth of stars in our brain making synaptic connections. And really, if you can Google it, but if you see these synaptic connections going on in the brain, your brain is lighting up. It looks like a fireworks show. So through your neurons they're talking to each other. They're passing this information, and this information looks like chemical and electrical signals, which actually creates our brains to light up, which is pretty cool. When our neurons are talking to each other, it happens consciously, but it also happens in a default mode network. And that's kind of the background. So when we talk about how our brains work, we have all of our neurons connecting, but then we have this default mode network of neurons. And they're kind of like the background. They keep us going. So our brains are constantly running this background information for us as well. And then, so we have conscious thought, we have default mode network. Now I'm going to throw brain wavelengths are in there too. So, and I could literally talk about that for a whole nother hour. But that's kind of like if you're thinking about your brain shifting into different mental states, that's your brain wavelengths are constantly changing too. So we have all of that going on in our brains at the same time. And I think God's design, it is so complex what is going on in our brains, but it's also so simple. We walk around and you don't think about your brain wavelength. I don't think about my default mode network or how many neurons just connected to tell me to wiggle my toe. We just exist in our living. And all of the connections that we're making, we get a choice in how we want our brains to connect. And that's that neuroplasticity. The thoughts we think make the highways for our brains, for our neurons to travel down. And so if something isn't serving us or we've done it one way for a certain amount of time, and then we switch to a different way, we can build a new superhighway a different way for our neurons to travel. So one of the other cool things that our brain does is, I'll use kindness as an example. So let's say I see two people, one person's the giver of the kindness, one person's the receiver of the kindness, and I'm the bystander. The person who does the act of kindness and the person who receives the kindness both have a chemical reaction in their brains. They'll carve a neural network that lights up, and again, it's that serotonin, happiness, dopamine, that reward, and that oxytocin, which makes you feel loved. Those two people experience that. Me, as the bystander, just observing it, I had the same chemical reaction happen in my brain. So we helped, when God calls us to be connected, he's connected our brains as well. My brain lights up with those same helpful chemicals to balance my brain when I just observe kindness. So we are all connected, and we can light each other's brains up just by when we are kind to each other. So it's just kind of cool when you really think about how God wired our brains to be, what he calls us to be and do is already woven into our brains.
I love that. Yeah. It's just such a cool, and when you think through also in scripture, it's like, pursue gratitude and, your kindness and compassion, that it truly isn't just like, that's a good idea, but it actually is, God has hardwired us to that to be good for us.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk a little bit about this. As we're talking about peace of mind, obviously there's in a humanity, there are lots of neurodivergencies. So there's lots of different things that are at play in our brain. Some of it is biological, some of it is psychological, with whether experiencing trauma or hard events in our lives that our brains are having to process. But kind of in addition to that, there's this kind of chaos that happens in our brains that kind of tried to rob us of the peace. So what happens when that is actually happening? Like that is actually like something that's going on within our minds and our brains that we can kind of understand a little bit of like popping the hood to what's happening under there.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is, while I would love for us to all live in a peaceful outer state our whole lives, that's actually not how our brains were created. God created our brains to actually thrive and make new neural connections when we feel stress and struggle. So the outer world is not always going to be peaceful. And through those struggles, when we figure out new solutions to our problems, when we get knocked down but we get up again, what's actually happening in your brain is making new neural connections, new pathways to help you solve that problem for next time. Your brain's forward thinking and helping you to be able to solve that. Really, struggles are kind of like weightlifting for your neurons. It's making you stronger for the next time you have a struggle. But I will say, getting in a stressful state for an elongated period of time doesn't build resilience, it builds burnout. So we have to have the balance between, we learned something, but also we're taking the restful time as well, and we're finding a way to carve into that time where we can have downtime and sort of reflect on how we think about what we're thinking about. So I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening in your brain when you are feeling stressed or have been under stressors for a while. So you have the first thing is you're going to have a feeling. That feeling's going to register in your amygdala. So your amygdala, whenever you have a really big feeling, you can just think something the size of an almond is where it's registering in your brain. So you can think, oh, great, this is all happening, and it's processing through something the size of an almond. So it registers in your brain. You have a big feeling. That processing in your amygdala says, like, emergency, emergency. And when it's saying emergency and it's sending that fight or flight response to you, what's happening is then your prefrontal cortex, which is your thinking, logical, managing your emotion portion of your brain that controls that, actually quiets down a little bit and you don't have full access to it. So it does that because your amygdala's job is to keep you safe. And if there really truly were an emergency, you would want your amygdala to take over and not have a whole logical thought about why you should get away from the bear. You just need to get away from the bear. So when your amygdala's in overload mode and you're constantly under stress, what's happening is you're kind of shortening the fuse you have for your emotional responses. And over time, not having access to logical thinking skills in your prefrontal cortex and having your amygdala be online all the time, it puts an overdue burden on the rest of your brain and body. And I'm just going to read a couple of things that happen. First of all, your hormones can get out of whack. Just like I talked about the positive neurotransmitters that happen, we all have cortisol in our bodies, and cortisol is our stress hormone. We live with it, and it doesn't really it's pretty neutral until we have an overabundance of it. And when we have an overabundance of cortisol streaming through our system all the time, it does things like cause chronic inflammation. It raises our heart rates. It causes that default mode network that got me to work so nicely, it causes it to start to go a little wacky, and we'll start having ruminative thoughts. And I'll wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and think, why did I say that to my third grade crush? And it just sends you completely offline with your thoughts. And you start having these sort of thoughts that in your belief system and yourself that don't feel right or feel off or feel negative all the time. And then some other things that happen is another part of God's design, you have a nervous system and you have the parasympathetic side and the sympathetic side. The parasympathetic is your rest and digest, and your sympathetic is the one that's trying to keep you alive and do all the things. And when we increase our sympathetic, that increases blood flow, it increases our heart rate, it kind of can mess with your digestive tract a little bit. So if we constantly have that one activated and we never get to the rest and digest, we quickly become out of balance in our bodies as well. And then it fuels that, and then we just get sort of in a hamster wheel of the self-doubt and the stress, and we don't really know how to get ourselves out because we've become out of balance. But the good news is our brains are resilient, and if we can start to carve some new neural pathways, we can start to create that neuroplasticity and that change to help us get that balance back in our lives.
I love this idea because I think we talked a little bit about, I think about it as ruts, but you talk about it as neural pathways. But we've kind of thought the same thing over and over and over again, and so it's just our default mode. It's like, oh, this happens, and I think these, a lot of times, unfortunately, negative thoughts, go in this direction. And so I think this is the idea of taking those thoughts captive of like, actually, is this true? Is this helping me? Is this serving me? Is this actually what God wants for me? And kind of picking our thought up and being like, nope, we're going to go on this pathway. But the hard part is right away, that pathway isn't, it's not actually like going to be easier.
Yeah.
But it's through time. So I think sometimes we get discouraged because we're like, I captured my thought and I tried the nice thing, and it's way easier for me just to land over here. But it's over time trying to carve new pathways that we, in some ways, force our minds and our brains to focus on until that becomes an easier path.
Yeah, and your brain's job is to be efficient. So if you have done something the same way over and over and over again, even if it's not serving you, your brain's inclination is to just get on the superhighway and take that path, is because it's the fastest route from A to B. So carving that new pathway takes some time, but then once you've carved it and you've practiced that over and over and over again, that becomes the new superhighway, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. You talked about like a little bit the inbox, is that we have all these emails that come in, and some of them we signed up for years ago, and we're like, we don't need that anymore. But we just let it kind of live in the kind of constant state of our mind. And sometimes it's taking the intentionality to be like, I don't need that. And so I am, Lord, would you help me in kind of sending this to spam?
Yeah, Lord, please help me move it to the spam box. I like that.
Okay, so the other option is that, for some people, they're like, this is why I just don't think about anything. I would prefer to turn my brain off and just like go on default mode, and I just kind of any emotion or negative thing I feel, I just like set over here, and that is how I find peace of mind. And that sounds chaos of thinking all of those thoughts, so I've just decided I don't want to think about anything. So talk a little bit about what that does to our brains.
Yeah, well, if any of you have heard me speak before, I call that ostriching. That's putting your head in the sand. And sometimes we do it and we're very conscious, like, I don't want to think about that today. And sometimes we don't do it consciously, especially if we've had chronic stress, traumatic stress, then that can be something that has just become part of our neural network and who we are. And one of the things I will say about that is that distraction in and of itself is not a bad thing in small doses. So, for example, if my amygdala is kind of going offline because I feel very angry towards somebody, I may sit down on my couch and say, I'm going to read my book for 10 minutes to help calm that or to work through that emotion so that I don't go yell at that person. That's a time when distraction can be helpful. What is not helpful is when we're constantly using distraction and then we're not circling back to have those conversations or to reflect and sort of analyze our thoughts. And then we just let our lives continue to go on that stressful plane. And here's the truth. That default mode network I talked about earlier, it's always keeping the score. Your brain is constantly surveying to keep you safe. It's looking for dangers out there. So it is scoring when you have those stressors and you're just choosing not to look at them. I often use the analogy of like, you have a really messy closet and you keep shoving things in there and then you're holding the door closed and maybe you have people over your house and you're like, oh gosh, please nobody even like walk by that door because it could spring open at any moment. And so you're so busy trying to keep the doors of that closet closed, like, you're having the conversation, you're sort of leaned against the door and you're like, oh yeah, everything's great. But what's happening is you are expending all your mental energy with holding whatever is in that closet so the door doesn't swing open and you don't feel embarrassed when it all spills out. And you're not spending any mental energy in actually finding peace of mind. You're not spending any energy in finding the balance for your brain. You are spending all your energy on trying to keep that stress behind the wall, and what happens is you start to disconnect from yourself. When you're not acknowledging any of your stressors or your emotions or things that are building up, you start to create a wall, and that wall is between you. It can often be between those you love. It can be for the things that you used to find really enjoyable. You start to say, it's not as fun as it used to be, or I used to find joy in that, but I don't anymore. And I think the biggest thing and the most harmful thing is it can build a dam between you and your relationship with God. You're holding back so much that you're not letting anything through, so there's not that communication between you and God. And I think that can be the most harmful thing when we just ignore and we don't process. And I know that opening that closet door is going to take a little bit of mess, and it's probably going to fall out on my head, but I think sorting through it in the long run is probably something. It might take the help of a professional to help sort through all that, but I think it's an important thing to do.
Yeah.
And I have also found in the kids I've worked with, sometimes the anxiety about opening the closet door is sometimes greater than what actually lies beyond the closet door sometimes. If you will allow me one more really nerdy moment. I just wanted to show you guys over time, if you guys don't mind putting up the neuron. Yep, thank you. So in our brains, when we are exposing ourselves to chronic stress and we're not doing that balance, we're not finding that rest and renewal, what happens over time is you will see on the right side, there's this giant, the neurons have their dendrites with all the branches, and on the left side, neurons exposed to chronic stress can't grow and actually shrink and weaken over time. So what happens in our brain is we don't have as many synaptic connections, and we can't make as many connections to solve our problems in our brain. So I think it's just really important to know that it does have an effect on our brain when we don't find that balance and that peace of mind in our lives.
Love it. All right, well, I know you're really passionate about tools, but we don't have time to do that. So we are bringing back the Heartland Bonus Content Podcast. And so this week, Erin's going to join us, and we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about this, as well as some great tools that you've seen and kind of helped with kids, but we can take as well.
Yeah, Ashley, when she asked me to come speak today, I'm like, I would love to. And then I went into my toolbox, and she's like, no, just informative. And I was like, no, I gotta say, how do we do this? So anyway, so I was so glad she was like, we could do the bonus podcast. Don't worry, Erin. So I was like, great. So I will be on there with some tools and just little things you can do differently to help wire some new neural pathways. So anyway, thank you guys for having me.
Erin.